It's a shocking story, what we just listened to there.
Yeah.
And not one that's necessarily very common these days, but certainly back in the day, there was a massive problem with football violence.
Hugely, yeah. I mean, and it's far divorced from what we see today. We're talking back in probably starting at the end of the 60s, going into the mid-70s. By the 80s, it was organised crime. In the 70s, much in common with every other area of public life or any other area of social life, if you like, this was the 70s, it was mob rule stuff, it was just disorganised chaos, quite frankly.
Right.
When we got to the 80s, it became much more serious. It became ostensibly organised crime. So you had firms attaching themselves to football clubs, Millwall, West Ham, Chelsea, Cardiff, Leeds, Birmingham City, Stoke, all these clubs, OK, and more. Now, the word firm is very, very important because a lot of these people came from commercial backgrounds. So that in London, for example, if you're a West Ham fan or Millwall fan or Chelsea fan, the chances are you were holding down a very good job, you're working 9 to 5, you had a family, you had a mortgage and a Ford Sierra, all the rest of it. And that's why the police took so long to get to grips with the perpetrators of these crimes. They just assumed it was the local kids from the nearest estate. Yes, they were foot soldiers involved, but the perpetrators, the organisers, were extremely smart. They were using mobile phone technology back in the 80s when nobody else had them. Mobile phones were about that big at the time. They were using the tube network to use ambushes. They were using military tactics. But it took social scientists to get involved and actually find out who was behind all this.
Yeah.
So it's much different to what we're seeing today. I'm not saying none of it today is organised. I mean, the Andrew story there illustrated or referenced Euros 2016. That was organised by Russia. They've been training for that ostensibly. Their group, their firms, who, again, had copied the English disease, as it was called back in the 80s. They had attached themselves to individual clubs like Spartak Moscow, Shakhtar Donetsk, Zenit St. Petersburg, all the rest of it, and they had copied what the English do and literally turned the tables. By now, of course, 20, 30 years later, yes, there is a little bit of problem, a few problems that follow England around. We saw that last summer, but that was more sort of chaos. It wasn't organised stuff that we were seeing back in the 80s. Organised gangs going around causing mayhem, but it was strategised.
Yeah, and why did they do it? Why did these people who were essentially holding down quite a good job, as you've just said there, with a bit of money, there was quite a lot of fashion around it as well.
Oh, hugely.
Was it just because they thought it was just a bit of a rush to knock a few heads together at the weekend?
It was cultural. So it was. I remember it when I was at school. The lads, maybe 3 or 4 years ahead of me, they were where I grew up in Kent. It was more Millwall was the thing, West Ham was the thing, right? A bit of Chelsea, some other. They were like a second division of football firms as well. QPR involved, Oxford United, Luton, that kind of thing. And it was cultural. Listen, it wasn't hand-to-hand combat. It was more to going to matches and being a bit naughty. Throwing a stone. If you look at most football violence on footage on YouTube going back in the day, it's just people standing around going like this.
Yeah,
it's that kind of stuff. It's what they used to call scarfers. People who weren't really there for trouble. They just wanted to be near it and feel the adrenaline rush.
Feel the rush.
Because that's what it's about. And so it was a cultural thing. Most of the people grew out of it. I mean, I still go to QPR now and I see a guy who's well known to have been involved in hooliganism back in as far back as the 70s. He's not been able to go into QPR for about the last 30-odd years because he's been banned, but he still stands outside looking to kind of relive or smell that atmosphere. This guy was known, he travelled with England, he travelled around with all the QPR, and if you were a second division hooligan like QPR, but you wanted real aggro, maybe you went along with Chelsea, because it's slightly bigger and they had bigger games going on. So it was cultural, everyone knew each other, it was cool to get involved in it, but it wasn't until the police and the social scientists got together and worked out who the perpetrators were until they identified them.
And we're obviously not back there now, and indeed it does appear that this kind of behaviour is mostly coming from people from other countries as well, like the Russians that we've just seen there. But look, I understand that you obviously speak with quite a bit of authority on this issue. You've got a bit of a familial link, essentially.
Yeah. A member of my family, extended family, was caught in possession of CS gas back in the late 80s. Now, he has completely turned his life around. He's unrecognisable from the person he was then. He actually wasn't that bad outside of this incident, but he was swept up in it. He was literally swept up in it. And he had Sergio Tacchini and a Les and Pringle sweaters and all the rest of it. That was part of the culture. They were called the football casuals. They travelled round on a football special, which was a designated train, which the British Rail, the old British Rail, were actually so concerned that these trains would get wrecked that they would provide old rolling stock for fans to travel on. So, I don't know, Crystal Palace are playing up at Bolton on a Saturday, they'd have one carriage, then West Ham would have another carriage. They were sealed off from each other. And then the nightmare for, even today, for the fixture computer is that you have to work out where your matches are on a Saturday, and you have to work out, hang on a minute, what's the chances, if West Ham are playing up at Man United, what's the chances they're going to run into Chelsea at Manchester Piccadilly at 5:45?
And would that still kick off?
Listen, I don't think not as often as it would do, but listen, with cocaine involved and with booze involved, all bets are off. Anything can happen. I mean, the cocaine thing wasn't really there back in the 80s and 90s so much. I mean, now it's latterly a development that's kind of emerged within the football scene. And I've been in corporate areas, in football grounds. I've seen lengthy queues for the toilets. We all know what's going on. There need to be sniffer dogs at the ground to stop it happening. And there needs to be, not just on the terraces or in the seating areas, but also in the corporate areas. That's where it's going on. Now, I'm not saying those people in the corporate areas are necessarily engaging in trouble, but it's part of a wider culture.
Part of a culture, isn't
exactly.
it? Exactly. And just in terms of football's all about league tables at the end of the day. Where are we now in terms of the global hooliganism league table, do you think?
I would say England is still... there are still problems here, and there is still a risk when England go abroad. We are, after all, playing a Nations League game next month behind closed doors at Molineux, which is very embarrassing on the FA. They're trying to go for national tournaments. They're not going to get them too often if that's happening. But the odds are stacked against us anyway because, technically our bids are perfect, but we haven't had a major international tournament with the exception of last summer, which was...
Is that because we don't buy it?
I wouldn't say we don't buy it. I think we buy it too much. We look too desperate. We look too desperate to hold it. It's a great thing for the whole country because it engages the whole city. It's not like the Olympics, which is just about East London. In 2012, a load of middle-class people going to watch sports they never heard of. This was
exactly. Javelin. Ooh.
This is real football, a real world-class event, and it involves Cardiff. Not Cardiff, obviously, because it's if it was a British bid, it would. But Plymouth were in the running for the World Cup. Places like Leicester, Southampton, Ipswich, Norwich, they get a nibble on the pie, as well as the likes of Wembley and Old Trafford and Anfield, etc. So that's different. So they're looking too desperate a lot of the times. And FIFA and UEFA, whoever's awarding the tournament, have just inexplicably, we know what happened in Qatar in 2010. But that's a bid that England should have got. Technically, we have the best stadiums in the world for one country. It's easy to get around. We should have had a World Cup. We've not had a World Cup since 1966. It's astonishing.
Absolutely. But look, Aidan, thank you very, very much. Great to have you on the show, and hopefully I'll get you on one of my Friday night ones again very soon.
Love that.